The 13 Colonies, Chapter 6, The Story of Maryland. The big question: why was Maryland created, and how did people there escape some of the problems faced by the colonists in Virginia? A friend of the king in the early 1600s, George Calvert, worked for the King of England as a government official. The job was very important. Calvert worked hard and did his work well. As a result, the king promised him a reward. The king told Calvert he would give him a lot of land in America, but there was one big problem. George Calvert was a Roman Catholic. That made a lot of Protestant people very unhappy. They did not want a Catholic to be a government official. Calvert was forced to give up his job. Almost everybody in England was a Christian, but English Christians were divided into different groups that disliked each other. One group was the Catholics. The king rewarded George Calvert's service by giving Calvert land in America. Catholics believed that the Pope in Rome was the head of the whole church. Another group was the Protestants. Most English Protestants believed that the king was the head of the church in England. Although George Calvert had changed his religion from Protestant to Roman Catholic, the king liked him. He gave Calvert the title of Lord Baltimore, the first Baron of Baltimore. He was named Lord Baltimore after a small place in Ireland. Most people who lived there were Catholics. Because most of the people in England were Protestants, the laws of England were sometimes unfair to Catholics. But in countries where most of the people were Catholics, such as France, Spain, and Portugal, the laws were sometimes unfair to Protestants. Maryland's first owner. George Calvert wanted to start a colony where English Catholics and Protestants would all be treated fairly. This colony would be a refuge or a place where English Catholics would be protected. The king thought this was a fine idea, so he gave Calvert permission to build a colony just north of Virginia. The new colony was named Maryland for Queen Henrietta Maria, the king's wife. George Calvert died shortly after the king gave him Maryland. His oldest son, Cecilius, became the second Lord Baltimore and the new owner of Maryland. Maryland's second owner. Unlike Virginia, which was owned by a company, Maryland was owned by one man. Although he lived in England, Cecilius Calvert owned all the land and made all the rules. The new Lord Baltimore asked his younger brother Leonard to go to Maryland with the first group of colonists. Leonard would be the governor of the new colony. The Calverts started Maryland as a colony for Catholics, but they also wanted Protestants to settle there to increase the colony's population. The new colony. In early spring 1634, two small ships sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. Governor Leonard Calvert and nearly 200 colonists were on board. The ships had no extra space. The passengers had brought with them most of what they would need to survive their first year in the new colony. Governor Calvert told a group of Native Americans that he wanted to buy one of their villages. The Native Americans were not using the village. They agreed to let the newcomers live there while the colonists built their own houses and planted crops. The governor knew how badly the people in Virginia had suffered. He made sure that the people of his colony had enough food and supplies to avoid a starving time. Governor Calvert named the colonists' new home St. Mary's City. This became the first settlement in the Maryland colony. Home in a wigwam village. 2 years later, in 1636, the settlement still looked like a Native American village. The colonists lived in wigwams that the Native Americans had built. Some of the Maryland colonists were wealthy Catholics, but more Protestants than Catholics came to Maryland. Many of the Protestants worked for the Catholic gentlemen as servants. Everyone in St. Mary's City worked hard to get the colony started. Catholic gentlemen and Protestant servants worked side by side. Governor Calvert had the colonists build a chapel or small church for St. Mary's City. Both Catholics and Protestants shared the chapel so that each group could worship in its own way. In 1649, the Toleration Act was created in Maryland. The act gave religious freedom to all Christians in the colony. Tough times for all. In both Maryland and Virginia, things did not work out as the colonists had hoped. The Virginia Company lost so much money that the King of England took direct control of Virginia. The Calvert family still owned Maryland, but not too many Catholics actually settled there. In the early days of Virginia and Maryland, many colonists became sick and died. Children often saw one or both of their parents die. Many children died too. At first, Virginia and Maryland planters thought that raising tobacco was almost as good as finding gold, but soon they were shipping so much to England they could not sell it all. There was too much tobacco and not enough customers. This caused the price of tobacco to drop. After the first few years, anyone who raised tobacco had a very hard time making money. The only way planters could make money from raising tobacco was to own lots of land, have lots of workers, and ship lots of tobacco to many places. Getting enough land was not that hard to do. Finding workers, however, was more difficult. Fewer English people were willing to move to Virginia and Maryland to be indentured servants. Keeping indentured servants was also very expensive. Planters needed another way to find large numbers of workers. They found these workers in Africa. Servants and enslaved workers. The very first Africans were brought to Virginia in the year 1619. Some historians think that these African workers were indentured servants. Others believe they may have been enslaved. They worked for a period of time on a plantation, and then they were free to leave. Some became free landowners, just as English indentured servants did. In the mid-1600s, however, Virginia and Maryland planters changed the rules. Africans brought to the colonies were forced to become enslaved workers. They were considered the property of an owner. They were not paid, and most would never be freed. Their children would become enslaved workers too, and relying on enslaved workers meant that plantation owners could make more money. By the late 1600s, large numbers of enslaved Africans were brought to work on plantations near the Chesapeake Bay. They were treated harshly. In one southern colony, so many enslaved Africans were brought in that more than half of the people living there were originally from Africa. That colony was called Carolina. This is the end of the chapter.